A recurring case study that we've used throughout this module is the frontier of the American West. In previous sessions we talked about Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis, and we've used John Ford's film The Searchers as an example in a previous session as well. What I want to do now is talk a little bit more about westerns as a quintessentially geographical film genre. This is movie week, so I'm going to talk about Cowboys and Geographers. For this week's session, if you're doing this as part of the Kiel Inspirational Landscapes module, you've got this video, and I'll also have a sway presentation after this, which will contain some more detail on what I'm talking about here, along with some video examples from movies to show you some specific examples of things that I've been talking about. Now, it's important to realise at the very beginning of thinking about westerns that most history is written from the winner's point of view, and American westerns are essentially part of the conqueror's viewpoint, or the conqueror's mythology of the history of the American West. In 1492, about 10 million people in diverse native cultures lived in what we now call North America. By 1900, that number had decreased to just 250,000. That's one part of the history of North America. The winners' histories, if you want to call them that, include ideas such as Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis. And most of the westerns that Hollywood made, certainly in the classic period between, say, 1939 and 1969, most westerns adopt that approach, that viewpoint of American history. And that's one of the things that we'll be looking at in some of our examples. But it's important to begin by recognising that this is very different, well, this is a very specific view of history, and that there are very different, for example, indigenous viewpoints. There are different histories of the West, and Hollywood westerns, Western movies, certainly in that period in the mid-20th century, very much portray one version of that history. So, as we talk about westerns, it's important to remember, for example, these words from Russell Means of the American Indian movement. He said, for him, when he looks at the American flag, the red on the flag stands for the blood of the people spilt in the claiming of this land. The blue stands for the coldness of the white man's heart. The white stands for the white supremacy that this country is founded on. This is what I see when I look at the flag of this nation. So that's an alternative viewpoint, and not one that you'll see being reflected very much in westerns of the mid-20th century. So be aware that there's history and there's mythology of the American West, and the history presented by Hollywood westerns is one specific version of that history. And that fits into the context of what we've talked about previously, about how cinema and art in general can be used for a variety of purposes, including the recasting of histories and the creation of propagandas and of false memories. Now, we talked in a previous session about Frederick Jackson Turner and his frontier thesis, his paper, The Significance of the Frontier in American History. And he said, the existence of an area of free land, its continuous recession, and the advance of American settlement westward explain American development. That was his thesis, that the movement of the frontier across America is the fundamentally most important factor in the history of America, in the development of the American character. Now, there are all sorts of issues, all sorts of problems with that we pulled out before. For example, the notion of the idea of free land and the implication that has for the attitude towards the 10 million indigenous population that was there before white men arrived and the frontier started moving westwards. But also from a geographical point of view, we pulled out the idea of what we sometimes call the ergodic approach, the substitution of space and time. As the frontier continues, as a series of waves of frontier move westwards across America, for any one location, as frontiers move across them, the nature of that location changes over time. And so eventually we have a location which is built up on this palimpsest of historical frontier crossings, these transitions that operate through history. Now, this theory, or versions of Turner's frontier thesis, were the dominant theory in white American history for most of the 20th century, and you can see it as being the key to understanding most classic westerns. The transformation of the cultural landscape by the passage of these frontiers, associated with characters essentially from the Old West who make possible the transformation of the landscape of the society into the New West, but then can't remain as part of that New West. And you've seen this before in a previous session when we talked about the Searchers and we looked at the character of Ethan Edwards, played by John Wayne, and the idea that he belonged in the Old West, but a character like him couldn't make the transition into a civilized New West. He was very much part of the savage Old West, and he's necessary to enable the culture to make that transition, but then he's not required or welcome after that transition. And that's why so many of the heroes in classic American Westerns have to ride off into the sunset or get killed at the end of the story, because they have no place in the new civilization that they've been fundamental in helping to create. So as we're talking about Westerns, be aware of all these different fictions versus histories for a whole list of different topics that we'll encounter. So whether we're talking about the indigenous nations, whether we're talking about the state of the landscape into which the incomers came, was it a desert, was it a garden, as we're talking about the successive waves of incomers, from pilgrims through to cattlemen through to farmers, are they discovering this new territory? Are they conquering the new territory? Are they settling? Is it a question of settlement, or is it a question of genocide? And within those incomers, the land use conflicts, farmers versus ranchers, whether to fence the range, who's going to use the water. There are alternative takes on that history of the development of the West in terms of what's essentially at the heart of a lot of Westerns, these land use conflicts between different potential users of the land at different stages in the transition of the frontier. And we're looking here at a landscape which is changing over time, and whenever there's change there is inevitably context, and people are viewing the landscape in different ways and have different ideas of what home within that landscape should look like. But one of the key areas of history versus fiction, if you like, is this whole idea of the representation of events at the frontier as being pivotal in the history of the development of the region. And that's something that comes out very strongly in lots of Westerns, including, for example, the Searchers that we keep talking about as one of our key examples. The fact that what happened in that episode, in that film, or what happens in the episodes represented in many, many Westerns, are frontier events that mark the transition from a pre-frontier cultural, social, physical landscape through the frontier moment to a post-frontier, settled, civilized, modern American state. And this is the theory behind a lot of Westerns, that it's that transition from one state to another that generates the action, the momentum within the movie. Now, there's a film directed by John Ford, the same person that made The Searchers, and starring John Wayne, the same chap who was in The Searchers, a film called The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. And in that film, the whole film is a flashback to events happening on the frontier, but seen from the view of a post-frontier time. And a senator is looking back at what happened in a frontier town and talking to the newspaper man about it. And when he's told the truth of what really happened, the newspaper man says, "No, I'm not going to print that story. Now you've told me the truth of what happened, I'm still going to stick with the old version. I'm going to stick with the legend. Essentially, I'm going to stick with the myth of what happened in the Old West. Because," and this is the famous line from The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, "when the legend becomes a fact," in other words, once you actually find out the reality behind this great classic story, print the legend, stick with the old story, don't print the facts. And that idea underpins lots of what you'll be seeing or what you'll be thinking about when you're looking at Hollywood Westerns. The idea, well, there was fact, there is history, but there's also the legend, there's also the mythology. What are we going to go with, and what's going to be the balance between myth and history, fact and fiction in our histories of the West, in Westerns? A film called The Great Train Robbery that was released in 1903, so that's right at the start of cinema, is often listed as being the first Western ever made. So Westerns existed more or less from the very beginning of cinema. But the key thing about that date there is that that's still contemporary with the real West. Lots of Westerns that you look at are actually set around that date. This is still, certainly in some parts of the country, this is still within Wild West time. So the myth-making about the West was contemporary with the actual history of the West. So early Westerns, they weren't looking back on the Old West and guessing or trying to imagine or trying to recreate what it was like. They were being made by people who were actually there in the Old West and making these fictions about it. And I'm going to give you a couple of lines to think about here. One's a quotation from an article by Spencer Warren, and he says, "Popular culture in a democracy can and should elevate people, directing their eyes towards ideals and great truths. Few things did that more beautifully," he says, "than the classic Hollywood Western." So Spencer Warren there saying, yeah, the great Westerns give you a view of history that elevates you and direct your eyes towards ideals and great truths. So that's one view of the American Western. Or, and I give you my counter view here, the American Western is a geographical myth, providing a false identity for a people and a false justification for a history and for a political system. So that's an alternative point of view for you to consider. Not meaning to sound negative there with my view. I'm a great fan of Westerns, love Westerns, but for the purposes of you now thinking about how Westerns work and what they represent, I'd like you to think about those two alternative viewpoints to do with Westerns. Now, Westerns have been described as being like opera, and one way that they're like opera is that nowadays, to people who are not familiar with them, both opera and classic Westerns can seem quite unfamiliar in the way they're presented. You need to suspend everyday expectations based on other art forms, because these use their own special language and style. Westerns are different, in the same way that opera is different. It's not like real life. Now, one of the main similarities with opera is that both opera and classic Westerns address big human themes in sometimes quite uncomplicated ways. In a Western we know who's the hero and who the villains are. In the old days they wore different coloured hats to make sure we were in no doubt. The chap in the white hat was the hero, the people in the black hats were the villains. The love interest is normally clear. We know that the youngster is going to learn good sense from his elders before the film is over, and we're pretty sure right from the start that the hero at the end is going to ride off into the sunset. And as with opera, these big human themes are played out against a backdrop of scenery that can be fundamental to the story. In fact, that's more true of Westerns than it is of most opera. The Western is a fundamentally geographical genre in which the landscape is at the heart of the story, and that's one reason why it's useful for us to talk about in the context of this module. Now, you can do this with other genres, and I asked you to do this as an exercise before you watch this video, so you can think whether for science fiction or horror or romantic comedy or whatever genre you chose, can you identify some points such as this that you can say, well, yeah, that's geographical, that's geographical. But for Westerns, I would say, well, Westerns are a specifically geographical genre, partly for these reasons. They are set in a specific location, so it's very straightforward geography. They happen in a particular place at a particular time, but they happen in a particular place. And geographical themes, the kinds of topics that you'd study in a geography lesson, are central to the stories and to what's going on in lots of Westerns. For example, the idea of frontier, this boundary, this moving, transitioning boundary, the movement of a cultural landscape, the development over time of new cultural landscapes. That's the key theme in Westerns. Landscape is a key component, and as the frontier migrates through space, so the landscape, both the physical landscape but more so the cultural landscape, changes through time. Things are developing. Development is a major theme of Westerns. So migration, boundaries, land use conflicts, all these things which are straight out of a standard geography lesson, those are key topics in Westerns. Exploration, settlement, development, cultural relations. All these topics that are at the heart of Westerns are at the heart of geography. And one particular thing which is interesting is to try to look out for examples where characters, or even sets of characters, cultures, groups of people, are associated with particular parts of the landscape or types of landscape, and are associated with particular stages through time in the development in the transition of these frontiers across the landscape. So can we put people, characters or groups of people, into particular historical locations or spatial locations? And this allocation of characters to places, again, is a very geographical kind of an activity. And underpinning all of that, the main point I want to put to you in this session for you to think about is that this idea of the geographical transition, kind of associated with Turner's transition theory, but that geographical transition is the unifying paradigm that underpins the stories and the events that are happening in lots and lots of westerns. And we'll look at some examples of this in the next session, in the follow-up session. Now, a couple of points just to get you warmed up, get you thinking about westerns before we look at some specific case studies. First point, when you're looking at a western that's set in, I don't know, 1874 or something, the western that you're watching isn't going to tell you as much about 1874 as it's actually going to tell you about the time when the western was made, 1958, 1969, whenever that might have been. Westerns reflect the period that they're made as much as they reflect the period that they're set. For example, very simple example, in the styling or the fashion or the overall look of the characters and the landscapes that are being shown in the film. So here, for example, this is a photograph of the real Billy the Kid, Western outlaw, around about 1880. I've given you two photos, partly so you can have a close-up and also a more distant view of his outfit, but also because one of the interesting things about Billy the Kid is that for years there was dispute about whether he was left-handed or right-handed, and it was all based partly on nobody being sure which was the correct way around to print this photograph that was available of him. And in lots of prints he appeared to be left-handed with his pistol on his left-hand side. And you'll see why that's significant in just a second. But that's the real Billy the Kid. That's what he looked like. That's how he dressed. And then a few years later, here's Roy Rogers representing Billy the Kid. And there's not a great deal about Roy Rogers in the 1938 film that really reflects anything much at all to do with the real Billy the Kid, except, of course, you can see there he's got his pistol on the left-hand side. So that's Roy Rogers in 1938. So reminder, there's the real one. Here's Roy Rogers. Here's Paul Newman. The film was actually called The Left-Handed Gun, so picking up on this idea. But there's Paul Newman in 1958, and looking pretty much like a chap from 1958 there. Here we are moving forward into the 70s. You can see with the sideburns, the hairdo, the collar turned up. We're beginning to look very 1970s here, and that's Jeffrey Jewell playing Billy the Kid in a film called Chisholm in 1970. Here we are moving through into the 80s. There's Emilio Estevez. She looks a little bit like Billy the Kid, but the style there, that looks like a shot from a 1980s movie, as indeed it is. It doesn't look like a shot from the 1880s or a character from the 1880s. And here we are coming a bit more up to date with one of the most recent films I could find of Billy the Kid. And again, very contemporary to us, kind of gritty Western style there, which looks very different from the Roy Rogers version of the 30s, and actually looks a little bit more like the original version from the 1880s. But you can see there are changes there over time in the nature of the Western, not to do with any differences in the original history, but to do with differences in interpretation over time. Now, the style, the look, the design, if you like, that's a fairly superficial aspect. But I want to pick up on that, and this is a more important geographical thing for you to be thinking about as you're looking at some example Westerns later on. Westerns reflect the period when they're made, not just in terms of style and fashion, but in terms of politics. And the classic example of this is two films from the 1950s, a film called High Noon and a film called Rio Bravo. High Noon is widely regarded as being a liberal Western, if you like, or a Democrat Western, a left-wing Western. Some people even call it a communist Western. And it's about a marshal who stands alone to defend his moral principles, and it deals with topics such as civic responsibility and active involvement in social causes. It's all to do with how individuals and a society behave within a crisis. And these are problems or issues that were loaded with political overtones in the early 1950s when America was going through this period, the McCarthy era, when a lot of people were being called out and accused of having communist sympathies, and that wasn't tolerated in Hollywood at that time. And High Noon is widely thought of now as being a story that represents a particular point of view about how people should behave in a society. Now, other people came along, they said, well, we don't like the way this was done. And a director called Howard Hawks, this is John Wayne again here, working with John Wayne, made a direct response to High Noon, a film with a similar basic plot of a marshal who has to stand up to the bad guys and has the town around him for support. But Rio Bravo was written in a completely different tone. The marshal behaves in a different way, the townspeople behave in a different way, and it's often thought of as being the classic Republican Western. And when John Wayne talked about this afterwards and explained why they'd made their film, it's because he said, well, High Noon, he described it as being un-American because they didn't like the way that the marshal, the way that the townspeople behaved. And if you just Google politics of High Noon and read up on the detail of this, I'll try and put some reading on the KLE for you. There's a lot of discussion about these films, and you can apply it to other films as well. The point being that there is a lot of politics embedded in films, either deliberately because the films are being made to make a point, or even unconsciously because the filmmakers had a particular point of view, and so inevitably that point of view went into the underpinnings of the film. But there are a lot of westerns that are very specifically political in nature, but they're not telling you about the politics of the 1880s or the 1850s, they're telling you actually about the politics of the 1950s and 1980s when the films were made, and that's something really interesting for you to look out for in the nature of westerns. Don't think that westerns are telling you about the Old West, they're actually telling you about how people want you to think about the New West, if you like, or the America of the today, of the time the film was made. But Google politics of High Noon, look at some reading I'll put up on the KLE for you, and have a think about that. But one thing that you might think is more constant in westerns is the landscape, the importance of the land itself. And we've talked about John Ford previously. He's a chap who made, the director who made The Searchers and lots of other westerns. And he's famous partly for setting a lot of his westerns in Monument Valley, which was another of our case studies earlier in the module. And one thing that John Ford is supposed to have said is, he said, you can say the real star of his westerns has always been the land. And that stage, that setting within which events happen, is fundamental to westerns. And in many situations, the landscape, is itself a key part of the story. Things happen the way they do because of the landscape. You'll remember in the clip I showed you earlier on of The Searchers, there's a point where one character, after his son has been killed, he says, "Oh, Ethan, I blame this land. I blame the land for what happened." And the landscape becomes a character in the film. So one thing that's interesting, as you watch lots of different westerns, is to look at the landscapes that are used, and you can associate different landscapes with different directors who are trying to portray different aspects of American history or different aspects of the western story through the nature of the landscape that they use. So John Ford, for example, is famous for using Monument Valley. The Searchers in the top picture there, and I think that's Stagecoach in the bottom picture. But for many decades, John Ford was making films in Monument Valley, and because his films are amongst the most famous westerns, Monument Valley has taken on that kind of iconic status as being the western landscape. So if you ask people to imagine making a western or painting a western scene in the most kind of straightforward, iconic fashion, then you'll stick some of these monuments from Monument Valley in the background to make it look like a western. But there are lots of directors who made films in other locations for different reasons. For example, there's a director called Bud Bettiker who made a series of films starring Randolph Scott at a place called Lone Pine in California that has a really distinctive granite bedrock landscape that you can see in these pictures. And a lot of other directors made films in that area as well, partly because it was convenient location for filming. But it gives a very particular tone to the story to be set in this particular kind of landscape. Another director, Anthony Mann, is famous. He made a series of films with an actor called James Stewart, and he set his films in the Rockies, so they're set in the forests, on the rivers, in the mountains. There's a film called The Far Country, which even has a glacier in it. It was filmed, parts of it were filmed around the Athabasca Glacier in British Columbia, and there's an ice fall, and so you can imagine that western appeals to me for its particular landscape. But films shot in different landscapes have very different characteristics to them, and very different kinds of stories can occur in these different kinds of landscapes, based partly on the real history of what was going on in those different parts of the country at different points in the history of the West. And Sergio Leone, who you might have heard of before, or we've talked about Once Upon a Time in the West, one of his movies. We use that as an example early on in the module. And he filmed a lot of his westerns in Almeria in southern Spain. He was an Italian. We talk about spaghetti westerns, Italian westerns, but a lot of them were actually shot in Spain, but made by Italian companies. And Sergio Leone, his films have this characteristic look of the desert area of southeast Spain. But some of his shots, some of what he was doing, he filmed in Monument Valley. So the bottom left-hand side there a shot from Once Upon a Time in the West. In fact, both of those shots are from Once Upon a Time in the West. The top one film, a shot from a scene shot in Almeria. The bottom one, a scene shot in Monument Valley, because he knows, Sergio Leone knows, that Monument Valley is a classic, iconic Western landscape, so he can use it. If he wants to make a particular point, you can use the landscape to make that point. So in this case, he was trying to represent the progress of civilization into the West, and he wanted to make it startling and shocking. So what he actually does in the movie, he has railway lines being laid through Monument Valley. Now, that never actually happened, but it's just a way of representing the progress of the frontier. You take this archetypal Western wilderness desert landscape where John Ford shot all his Westerns and John Wayne did all these things in the old movies, and then Sergio Leone comes along in the late 1960s and he lays railway lines right through the middle of Monument Valley. Now that works in terms of making a point within the film if everybody recognises Monument Valley and associates it with old Westerns. So the point here is that we have to have this iconography, we have to have this shared language, and we need to be all able to draw on this shared cinematic landscape language or iconography within Westerns. So those are things for you to look out for when you're looking at some Westerns. What are these shared icons of the landscape? Now this is an image from Shane, another 1950s Western directed by George Stevens, 1953, and Shane was shot in the Grand Tetons in Wyoming, another very distinctive landscape. And I wanted to throw this shot in as we draw towards the close on this little video, because it sums up some of the key themes that you'll be seeing in a lot of Westerns. If you look at some examples, and when I give you the next video with some examples in it, we'll pick out some of these themes in lots of different Westerns. For example, you've got the big landscape, and we're separating out areas in the background there. You have the wilderness, the mountains, there's glaciers up there, but there's a mountain wilderness area. And then in the foreground, there's a civilized, settled area where we're thinking of farming or ranching, and we're putting up fences and so on. So we have small areas of civilization and settlement within this big, wild landscape, and that's a very common theme. We also have small characters or small groups of characters dwarfed by the mountains behind them in the background. So we have small people in a big landscape. We have small patches of civilization within big areas of wilderness. We commonly have younger and older generations which help to represent this transition from the Old West to the New West, very typically. We have the older character, or in the case of Shane, the adult character, who's an old Westerner. He rides into town, saves the day, and then has to ride out again, so that the young generation, the New West, can take over and move civilization forward into the future. Boundaries are a key theme in lots of Westerns. There's a Western called Man Without a Star, which is all about barbed wire fences and whether we should be fencing the range or whether we should be retaining an open range, and that's partly a battle between cattlemen and ranchers. Different users of the land want to use the land in different ways, and that leads to conflict. And as we gradually move through the different stages of the transition of the frontier over time, different people become dominant, and so different things are happening in the landscape. So a very common theme in Westerns is this idea of boundaries, either boundaries between the wilderness and civilization, or boundaries which are being set up as part of the progress of civilization in resolving some of these land use conflicts. So there are a lot of big themes from Westerns represented in just that one shot there. And one thing, well, what I'm going to do after this video is produce another resource. Probably I'll make a sway and put it up on the KLE for those of you that are doing this module as part of the your Keel program. And what I'm going to do is look at some more examples from Westerns and some specific details about how scenes and events within some of these Westerns reflect some of these big ideas. But Shane is a nice example of this. It's a classic transition Western, if you like. And again, Shane, the character Shane is the name of the character in the film. In a way, he's like Ethan Edwards. He's nothing like him in terms of character, but he's like him in the sense that he's this transitional character, a figure from the Old West who is necessary to help the civilization, the settlers, to make the transition into the New West. But then once you're in the New West, you don't want these characters from the Old West, these gunfighters hanging around in your new civilized society, so they have to ride off into the distance. So the wild old Westerners are needed to make the transition happen, but they can't stay around to live in this new world. And Western after Western, if you look at a few Western storylines, that's why the hero rides in, saves the day, makes progress for civilization possible, but then either has to be killed or ride off into the sunset at the end of the story. And so what I'm going to do next, draw this video to a close here, and I'll put up another resource onto the KLE for those of you who are doing this module with me, where we look in a bit more detail at some scenes from movies that show some of these classic ideas from Westerns in the specific context of those films. So hopefully this has just given you a rough idea of the fact that there are things that are worth looking at, some interesting ideas buried away in these old Hollywood Westerns, and now we'll go and look at a couple of examples just to give you some more detail if you're interested in that.